The porch light was still on. The dog was inside, cowering and terrified. The purses sat on the floor near the front door, wallets and identifications still tucked inside. Nearly $900 in cash lay untouched. 3 sets of car keys were scattered across the house. The front door was unlocked, but there was no sign of struggle. No broken windows. No overturned furniture. No blood. 3 women had been in this house just hours before. A mother, her daughter, her daughter's best friend. And now, as the morning sunlight crept through the windows of this quiet Springfield, Missouri home, they were simply gone. Vanished, as if they had evaporated into the humid June air. What happened inside this house in the early hours of June 7, 1992, remains one of the most baffling disappearances in American criminal history. More than 3 decades later, no bodies have ever been found. No one has ever been charged. And the truth of what happened to Sherrill Levitt, her daughter Suzie Streeter, and Suzie's friend Stacy McCall remains buried somewhere in the silence. It was graduation season in Springfield, Missouri, a mid-sized city in the southwestern corner of the state where everyone seemed to know everyone else. June of 1992 was hot and humid, the kind of weather that made the air feel thick enough to touch. The national news was dominated by the presidential race between George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Locally, the talk was all about graduations, summer plans, and the promise of what came next for the class of '92. For Stacy McCall and Suzie Streeter, June 6, 1992, was supposed to be one of the best nights of their lives. They had just graduated from Kickapoo High School in Springfield, walking across that stage in their caps and gowns, diplomas in hand, their futures stretching out before them like an open highway. Stacy was 18 years old, 5'3", with long dark blonde hair and a smile that lit up every room she entered. Friends described her as responsible, the kind of person who never missed commitments and always checked in with her family. She worked at the Springfield Gymnastics Center and had been accepted to Missouri State University. She suffered from debilitating migraines, but never let them slow her down or diminish her enthusiasm for life. Suzie Streeter was 19, 5'2", with shoulder-length blonde hair and a bubbly personality that drew people to her. She was a creature of habit, the kind of person who parked her car in exactly the same spot every single time she came home. She wanted to become a hairstylist like her mother, and she was excited about the future. Just days before graduation, she had gotten a king-sized waterbed delivered to her room and couldn't wait to show it off to Stacy. The 2 young women had been best friends for years, inseparable, the kind of friends who finished each other's sentences and knew each other's secrets. After the graduation ceremony at Missouri State University's Hammond Student Center, Stacy went home for a post-graduation dinner with her family. Her mother, Janice McCall, would later remember every detail of that evening. The way Stacy looked in her graduation dress, the sound of her laughter, the plans she talked about for the summer. Everything was normal. Everything was perfect. How could anyone know that in just a few hours, everything would shatter? Suzie had dinner at home with her mother, Sherrill Levitt. Sherrill was 47 years old, a divorced cosmetologist who worked at a salon called New Attitudes. She was beloved in the community, described by friends as being close to Mother Teresa in her kindness and devotion. She had raised Suzie through the difficulties of her divorce, working long hours to build a stable, comfortable life for them both. That night, Sherrill expected Suzie to be staying elsewhere after the graduation parties, so she planned to have a quiet night at home. Perhaps she looked forward to some peace and solitude, a rare luxury for a working single mother. The plan for the evening was straightforward. Stacy and Suzie would attend various graduation parties throughout the night, celebrating with their classmates. Then they would spend the night at the home of another friend, Janelle Kirby, whose house was hosting even more out-of-town guests and graduation visitors. It was a perfect plan, a safe plan, a normal teenage plan for a graduation night. As the evening progressed, the 2 young women bounced between parties, laughing and celebrating with their classmates. Around 10:30 p.m., Suzie called her mother to let her know the plans had changed. Instead of staying at Janelle's and then going on a trip to Branson with friends the next day, she would be coming home. Sherrill told her that was fine. It was the last time mother and daughter would speak. Around 11:15 p.m., Sherrill made her last known phone call, talking with a friend about plans to paint some furniture. After that conversation ended, she presumably prepared for bed, perhaps leaving the porch light on for Suzie out of habit, even though she now knew her daughter would be coming home that night. The parties continued. Sometime after midnight, Stacy and Suzie were at a gathering at the house of Janelle Kirby's neighbor in the Battlefield area of Springfield. The atmosphere was joyful, celebratory, exactly what a graduation night should be. But as the early morning hours approached, the girls realized they needed to make a decision about where to sleep. They headed to Janelle's house, arriving around 2 in the morning. What they found there changed everything. Janelle's house was packed with out-of-town relatives who had come for her graduation. The situation was crowded, chaotic, not ideal for an impromptu sleepover with 2 more people. The girls made a quick decision. They would head to Suzie's house instead. Suzie lived with her mother, Sherrill, at a modest 1-story home at 1717 East Delmar Street, just a short drive away. It made perfect sense. Suzie's new king-sized waterbed was big enough for both of them. They could sleep in, wake up whenever they wanted, and have the space and quiet they needed after a long night of celebration. Multiple witnesses at the party saw them leave together, heading to Suzie's house. The time was approximately 2:15 in the morning on June 7, 1992. They were happy, laughing, showing no signs of fear or distress. They had no idea they were walking into the last hours of their lives. Sometime between 2:30 and 3 in the morning, Stacy McCall and Suzie Streeter arrived at 1717 East Delmar Street. They would have seen Sherrill's car in the carport, noticed the porch light glowing in the darkness. But here is something that was wrong from the very beginning, a detail that would haunt investigators later. When Suzie's co-worker and close friend, Nigel Kinney, heard about the disappearance, one thing immediately struck him as odd. Suzie always, without fail, parked her car in exactly the same spot in the driveway. She was a creature of habit. But when people arrived at the house the next day, Suzie's car was not in its usual spot. It was parked differently. This small detail suggested something was already unusual when the girls arrived home. Had someone else's vehicle been parked there, forcing Suzie to park elsewhere? Or had someone moved the cars after the abduction? It was a question that would never be answered. The girls entered the house. We know they made it inside because evidence would later show they had prepared for bed. They went to Suzie's room. They changed out of their party clothes. Stacy folded her clothes neatly and placed them on a chair, as was her habit. But here is another disturbing detail. When the crime scene was examined, Stacy's shirt and underwear were missing from that neatly folded pile. Where did those items go? Were they taken by whoever abducted the women? The question hangs in the air, unanswered. Suzie and Stacy climbed into that new king-sized waterbed. They settled in for sleep. Makeup removal wipes were found in the room, indicating the girls had taken off their makeup and prepared for bed properly. In Sherrill's room, a book lay turned over beside her bed, as if she had been reading and then set it down, perhaps interrupted or perhaps simply ready for sleep. A television in Suzie's room was on, showing nothing but static, suggesting they had been watching a movie or late-night television but had never turned it off properly. Next to Suzie's cigarettes sat an unopened can of soda, as if someone had grabbed it planning to drink it but had been interrupted before opening it. All of these small details painted a picture of interrupted normalcy. These were not women who sensed danger. These were not women who were preparing to flee or fight. These were women who felt safe in their own home, who had settled in for a normal night's sleep after a long day of celebration. And then, at some point between roughly 3 in the morning and 7:30 in the morning, something happened. Something so quick, so efficient, so terrifying that 3 adult women were removed from that house without a scream, without a fight that left evidence, without alerting neighbors or leaving behind anything but questions. As the sun rose on June 7, 1992, the house on East Delmar Street was silent. Inside, a small Yorkshire Terrier named Cinnamon cowered in the bathroom, terrified of something she had witnessed but could never describe. The front door was unlocked. The porch lights still glowed, unnecessary now in the bright morning sunshine. And 3 women had ceased to exist in any way the world could detect. The first person to sense something was wrong was Janelle Kirby. She had expected Stacy and Suzie to arrive at her house sometime that morning to go on their planned trip to Branson. When they didn't show up and didn't answer phone calls, she grew concerned. Around 9 in the morning, Janelle and her boyfriend, Mike Henson, drove to the Delmar Street house to check on them. What they found was a scene that made no immediate sense. The front door was unlocked. They called out as they entered. No answer. The house was quiet. Too quiet. They noticed the purses right away. 3 of them, sitting near the front door. They looked inside and found wallets, money, identification. This simple, undeniable fact was the first screaming alarm bell. No woman leaves the house without her purse. Not one woman, and certainly not three. Janelle and Mike searched the house. They found the beds had been slept in. Suzie and Stacy had clearly shared Suzie's waterbed, their clothes from the night before scattered in the room. Sherrill's bed showed signs of use as well. The house looked lived in, normal, except for the complete absence of the people who lived there. They found Cinnamon, the little Yorkshire Terrier, hiding in the bathroom, trembling and clearly frightened. What had this animal witnessed? What had terrified it so badly that it sought refuge while its owners simply ceased to exist within these walls? Janelle noticed something else. Outside, near the front steps, there was a broken globe from the porch light. The decorative glass cover had been shattered, though the bulb inside was still intact. The broken glass lay scattered on the ground. What did this mean? Had there been a struggle outside? Had someone deliberately smashed the light to create darkness? Or was it simply an accident, unrelated to whatever had happened inside? Here is where the case took its first catastrophic turn. Mike Henson, trying to be helpful, swept up the broken glass and threw it away. It seemed like the reasonable thing to do at the time. Clean up the broken glass. Make the scene tidier. But in doing so, he destroyed what might have been crucial evidence. Was there blood on that glass? Were there fingerprints? Had it been broken during a struggle, or knocked over accidentally, or smashed deliberately? These questions would haunt investigators for decades because that potential evidence ended up in a trash bag and was lost forever. Janelle and Mike called more friends. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, people arrived at the house. Friends of Suzie and Stacy. Friends of Sherrill. People who wanted to help, who wanted to find answers, who couldn't believe that 3 women had simply vanished. One by one, they entered the house. They touched things. They moved things. They searched for clues. And with every well-meaning step, they contaminated what might have been a crime scene. At some point during this chaotic day, someone checked the answering machine. There was a message. Someone had called the house. But the message had been erased, either deliberately or accidentally. The machine's tape retained only a few seconds of audio. A male voice, faint and distorted. The word Wednesday seemed audible. Perhaps something about 9 or 90. But the message was incomplete, the full content lost forever. Who had left that message? What did it say? Why was it erased? Was it a message from the abductor, calling to confirm the women were gone? Was it an innocent call that someone deleted while searching for clues? The answer was gone, erased into digital silence. Throughout that long day, Janelle answered 2 phone calls that would add another layer of mystery to the case. Both were obscene calls. The callers sounded young, teenish, using profanity and the F word repeatedly. Were these calls connected to the disappearance? Or were they sick coincidences, cruel prank calls from teenagers who had somehow heard about the missing women? No one knew. What we do know is this. Between the time Janelle and Mike arrived around 9 in the morning and the time police were finally notified around 10:30 that evening, somewhere between 10 and 20 people had walked through that house. They had touched surfaces. They had moved objects. They had picked up phones and played back messages. They had swept up broken glass. They had, despite their best intentions, destroyed any hope of a pristine crime scene that might have yielded forensic evidence. Later in the afternoon, Stacy's mother, Janice McCall, arrived at the house. By this point, the situation was clear. Something terrible had happened. These 3 women had not simply gone somewhere without telling anyone. They had been taken. Janice made the decision that should have been made hours earlier. She called the police. But even when the Springfield Police Department arrived that evening, they did not initially treat this as an urgent case. Adults are allowed to leave their homes. Adults are not required to check in with their families. The police seemed to view this as a case of women who had simply gone somewhere without telling anyone. Perhaps they had taken an impromptu trip. Perhaps they were visiting friends. The families pushed back desperately. These women would never leave without their purses. They would never leave nearly $900 in cash sitting in a purse on the floor. They would never leave the dog alone without making arrangements. They would never simply vanish without a word. Something terrible had happened. Eventually, the Springfield Police Department opened a formal investigation. But precious hours, an entire day, had already been lost. The crime scene, if that's what the Delmar Street house truly was, had been hopelessly contaminated. Evidence may have been destroyed. Footprints may have been obscured. The answering machine tape had been compromised. The broken porch light glass was gone. From the very beginning, this case was fighting an uphill battle against time and circumstance.
As investigators began their work, they found themselves facing a mystery with almost no physical evidence. The house yielded no useful fingerprints except those of the victims and their known associates. There was no blood, no signs of forced entry, no indication that the women had been dragged or carried from the premises. 3 adult women had been removed from this house so efficiently, so completely, that they might as well have evaporated into thin air. The evidence that was present was almost more disturbing for what it suggested. The women had gone to bed feeling safe, they had undressed, removed their makeup, settled in for normal sleep. Something had happened after they had already gone to bed. This meant either an intruder had entered the house while they slept, or someone they knew and trusted had gained entry through deception or invitation. Investigators began constructing a timeline, interviewing everyone who had seen the 3 women in the hours before they vanished. Sherrill had last been seen at her salon on June 6th. She had closed up shop and headed home, apparently following her normal routine. Stacy and Suzie had been spotted at various graduation parties throughout the evening. Witnesses remembered seeing them happy, celebrating, showing no signs of fear or distress. Their decision to go to Suzie's house instead of Janelle's was a last-minute change of plans, made sometime after 2 in the morning. This detail would become crucial. If someone had planned to abduct these women, how would they have known that all 3 would be at the Delmar Street house that night? Sherrill living there was predictable, but Stacy and Suzie's presence was the result of a spontaneous decision made in the middle of the night. This suggested several possibilities. Perhaps the perpetrator had been targeting only Sherrill, and the girls were simply tragic witnesses who had to be eliminated. Perhaps the perpetrator had followed the girls from one of the graduation parties, waiting for an opportunity. Perhaps the perpetrator lived nearby and saw the girls arrive home, recognizing a sudden opportunity. Or perhaps the entire crime was more complex than anyone imagined, involving someone who knew the victims well enough to predict their movements, or who had been watching the house waiting for Sherrill. Investigators began digging into the backgrounds of all 3 women, searching for anyone who might have wanted to harm them. Sherrill's ex-husband was quickly investigated and cleared. He had an alibi for the night in question and showed no signs of involvement. Sherrill's personal life revealed no obvious enemies, no dangerous romantic entanglements, no financial troubles that might attract criminal attention. Her friends described her as kind, generous, almost saintly in her treatment of others. Who would want to hurt this woman? Suzie's background proved more complicated. She had recently broken up with a boyfriend named Dustin Rekla, and Dustin Rekla had a very disturbing history. He had recently been implicated in a grotesque crime. He and some associates had vandalized a mausoleum and stolen gold fillings from corpses. Suzie had reportedly given police a statement about this incident, helping investigators build their case against Rekla. Was this disappearance an act of revenge? Had Rekla silenced Suzie and her mother and her best friend to prevent them from testifying against him? The theory had appeal. It provided motive. It explained the targeting of Suzie specifically. But there were problems. Dustin Rekla was investigated thoroughly and was never charged in connection with the Springfield 3 disappearance. He maintained his innocence. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. And the question remained, how would he have known that all 3 women would be at that house on that specific night? Another disturbing detail emerged during the investigation. Suzie had been receiving prank phone calls at the residence ever since she moved in with her mother in the spring of 1992. Hang-up calls, heavy breathing, the kind of harassment that suggested someone was watching her, perhaps obsessed with her. Were those calls connected to her disappearance? Or were they unrelated harassment from some unknown creep? The calls had never been traced, and the caller was never identified. Stacy's background yielded even less. She was, by every account, exactly what she appeared to be. A responsible young woman who worked hard, maintained good relationships with her family and friends, and had no enemies anyone could identify. There was no reason anyone would target Stacy McCall specifically, which suggested that if she was the intended victim, it was a case of random predation, and if she wasn't the intended victim, she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the days turned into weeks, tips began flooding into the Springfield Police Department. Some were well-intentioned, but ultimately useless. Reported sightings of the women in other states, claims that they had been seen at gas stations or restaurants, but every lead fizzled out upon investigation. The women seen at these locations were not the Springfield Three. They were just women who resembled them, caught up in the desperate hope of families who wanted their loved ones to be alive somewhere, anywhere. Other tips were bizarre, even cruel. Psychics claimed to have visions of the women's locations, describing elaborate scenarios that led police on wild goose chases to remote locations where nothing was found. Anonymous callers made vague accusations against neighbors or ex-boyfriends or random strangers. Rumors spread through Springfield like wildfire, and suddenly everyone had a theory about what had happened to the Springfield Three. One early person of interest dominated the investigation and the public imagination. His name was Robert Craig Cox. Robert Craig Cox was the kind of man nightmares are made of. Cox was a convicted kidnapper and suspected murderer who had served time in prison for an abduction case in Florida. He had a documented history of violence against women, and critically, at the time of the Springfield disappearances, Cox was living in the Springfield area, having recently been released from prison. His very presence in Springfield during that critical window immediately drew intense attention from investigators. Robert Cox had worked as a utility worker, the kind of job that might give someone legitimate access to homes and properties, the kind of job that might teach someone how to approach a house without raising suspicion. When investigators questioned Cox about the Springfield Three, his responses seemed designed to taunt them, to play games with their desperation for answers. According to police reports, Cox reportedly told investigators that he knew the three women were dead. He claimed their bodies would never be found, but he stopped short of confessing to anything. He danced around the edges of admission, hinting at knowledge while maintaining plausible deniability. Was he involved? Was he the killer? Or was he simply a disturbed man seeking attention, inserting himself into a high-profile case to feel important, to feel powerful? Cox has never been charged in connection with the Springfield Three case. He has denied responsibility, but his comments have haunted the families and investigators for years. Because if he didn't do it, how would he know the women were dead? How would he know their bodies would never be found? These are not things one says about missing persons cases, unless one knows something, unless one was there. Robert Craig Cox remains a person of interest to this day. In the minds of many who have followed this case, he is the most likely suspect, but suspicion is not evidence. Knowledge is not proof. And without physical evidence, without a confession that goes beyond cryptic hints, there has never been enough to charge him with this crime. Another lead that captured investigator attention involved a gravedigger at a local cemetery who reported seeing a suspicious vehicle in the area during the critical window. The witness described seeing a distinctive van driving slowly through the neighborhood around 3 or 3:30 in the morning on June 7th. The timing would have placed this vehicle near the Delmar Street house during the window when the women likely vanished. The description of the van was circulated. Tips came in about similar vehicles, but the lead never led to an arrest. The van was never positively identified. The driver was never found. Was this van connected to the abduction, or was it simply someone driving through the neighborhood at an odd hour for reasons having nothing to do with three missing women? Without more information, the van remained just another tantalizing clue that led nowhere. There were also persistent rumors about connections to drug activity in the Springfield area. Some theorists suggested that the disappearances might be linked to criminal enterprises operating in the region, perhaps as an act of intimidation against someone, perhaps as retaliation for some perceived slight or debt, perhaps as a message to others involved in illegal activity, but no concrete evidence ever emerged to support these theories, and the families of the victims adamantly denied any involvement whatsoever in criminal activity. These rumors seemed to be nothing more than speculation, the kind of dark theories that spring up around any mysterious crime. As weeks became months and months became years, the search for the Springfield Three took on a desperate, almost quixotic quality. Investigators followed up on thousands of tips. They searched rural properties, they dragged lakes, they excavated farmland, and they found nothing. In 19, authorities searched 40 acres in Webster County based on a tip that the bodies might have been buried there. They found nothing. In 2002, a concrete company in Webster County was searched after a tip came in about a suspicious green van. Cadaver dogs alerted on 3 spots at the location. Bones were recovered and sent for testing. Hope surged. But the bones were tested and determined to be too old to be connected to the Springfield Three. Another dead end. In April 2003, farmland south of Cassville was excavated based on another tip. Investigators found what appeared to be possible blood evidence and a section of a green vehicle, consistent with the van that had been described by the cemetery gravedigger years earlier. The discovery seemed promising. Blood testing was conducted, but the results came back inconclusive. Was it blood? Was it something else? If it was blood, whose blood was it? The evidence raised more questions than it answered. Lake Springfield was searched multiple times over the years. Rural areas around Forsyth, Joplin, and Stockton were combed by search teams and cadaver dogs. Every tip, no matter how far-fetched, was investigated. Because when 3 women vanish without a trace, you chase every lead. You turn over every stone. You hope that somewhere, buried in the volume of false tips and dead ends, there might be one grain of truth that leads you home. On December 31st, 1992, New Year's Eve, approximately 6 months after the disappearance, something extraordinary happened. America's Most Wanted aired a segment about the Springfield Three case. During the broadcast, a call came in to the tip line. The caller was male, and according to police, the caller had prime knowledge of the abductions. This was not just another crank call. This was someone who knew details that had not been made public, someone who knew things only the perpetrator or a close associate would know. The operator tried to connect the caller to Springfield investigators so they could speak directly, but during the transfer, the call was disconnected. The caller never called back. For investigators and the families, this moment represented one of the most frustrating near misses in the entire case. Someone who knew what happened had reached out, and then, just as quickly, they were gone. Did they get cold feet? Did they realize the risk they were taking? Did someone stop them from making that call? The questions have never been answered. As the years accumulated, the case began to take on the characteristics of an urban legend in Springfield. The house on East Elmar Street became known as a place of mystery and tragedy. People would drive by slowly, staring at the modest one-story home where 3 women had simply ceased to exist. The story was told and retold, each telling, adding new speculation, new theories, new details that may or may not have been true. In 1997, 5 years after the disappearance, Sherrill Levitt and Suzie Streeter were declared legally dead. The state required some legal resolution for estate and financial purposes, even though no bodies had been found. But Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, refused to make the same declaration for her daughter. In an interview, Janice explained her reasoning with heartbreaking clarity. "Until I know 100% that Stacy is deceased, I will never declare her dead. They're going to have to find some remains somewhere before I call her legally dead. It's not for any reason other than if I do, and she's not dead. Think of how mad she'd be when she gets back. Think of how mad she'd be when she gets back." That single sentence contains within it all the desperate hope, all the impossible optimism, all the refusal to accept the unacceptable that has characterized Janice McCall's journey through these decades. Even now, more than 30 years later, she maintains that hope. Because what else can a mother do when her daughter has vanished and there are no answers? Sherrill's son, Bart Streeter, Susie's half-brother, also became a tireless advocate for keeping the case in the public eye. Bart maintained a blog about the case called Streeter Family Block for years, documenting new developments, sharing memories, and keeping the pressure on law enforcement to continue investigating. In 2013, he turned the blog over to his daughter, Dee Streeter, ensuring that the next generation would continue the fight for answers. The toll of this tragedy on the Streeter family has been immeasurable, but their determination has never wavered. And then, in 2007, a new development captured the attention of the nation and brought the Springfield Three case roaring back into the headlines. During conversations about the case, a theory had emerged and gained traction in certain circles. The theory suggested that the bodies of the Springfield Three might be buried beneath the concrete of a parking garage at Cox Medical Center South in Springfield. The theory was specific. It claimed that a witness had seen the women's remains disposed of at the construction site in 1992, before the concrete had been poured. The bodies, according to this theory, were entombed forever beneath thousands of tons of concrete and countless parked cars. A crime reporter named Kathy Baird found the theory compelling enough to pursue. She hired a mechanical engineer named Rick Norland to conduct ground-penetrating radar scans of the parking garage floor. The scans were conducted and they revealed something extraordinary. 3 anomalies were detected beneath the concrete. 3 areas where the ground-penetrating radar suggested something was buried. 3 objects, roughly the same size, consistent with what might be found at a burial site. When the results became public, the reaction was immediate and intense. Families began demanding that the parking garage be excavated. Online petitions gathered thousands of signatures. The pressure on Springfield authorities to dig up that concrete became enormous. Here, finally, was a concrete lead. Literally concrete. 3 anomalies, 3 missing women. The math seemed too obvious to ignore. But the Springfield Police Department responded with skepticism. Spokesperson Lisa Cox pointed out a critical timeline issue. The parking garage construction had begun in September 1993, more than a year after the disappearances in June 1992. Why would someone hold on to 3 bodies for over a year, waiting for a specific construction project to begin, when there were countless other places in rural Missouri to dispose of remains? The theory, while intriguing, didn't make practical sense. Furthermore, the cost of excavating the massive concrete structure was estimated at hundreds of thousands of dollars. The ground-penetrating radar, while useful, is not perfectly accurate. The anomalies could be anything: buried construction, debris, natural geological formations, voids in the concrete, old utilities, or yes, possibly human remains. But without more concrete evidence, no pun intended, authorities deemed the expense and disruption unjustified. As of today, the parking garage has never been excavated. The anomalies remain unexplored, and the question of whether the Springfield Three lie buried beneath that concrete remains tragically, frustratingly unanswered. For the families and for the many people who have followed this case over the decades, the refusal to excavate represents either reasonable caution or unconscionable negligence, depending on one's perspective.
Over 5,000 tips have been received by the Springfield Police Department over the past 3 decades. 5,000 people who thought they saw something, heard something, knew something. 5,000 threads that investigators pulled on, hoping one would unravel the mystery. But the case remains unsolved. The investigation has never been officially closed. Periodically, new detectives are assigned to review the case files. Cold case units from state and federal agencies have examined the evidence. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to whatever physical evidence was recovered from the house. DNA technology has advanced dramatically since 1992. Genetic genealogy has solved cases that seemed permanently cold, identifying suspects decades after their crimes by comparing crime scene DNA to genetic databases. But there is a fundamental problem with applying these powerful new tools to the Springfield Three case. There is no body. There is no crime scene that yielded significant biological evidence. There are no bloodstains to test, no hair samples with roots attached, no saliva on cigarettes or drinking glasses that could be analyzed and compared. The perpetrator or perpetrators left almost nothing behind. And without DNA evidence to analyze, the most powerful forensic tools of the modern age have limited utility. What makes this case so particularly agonizing is the absence of any solid, universally accepted theory. In most disappearance cases, investigators can at least construct a plausible narrative, even if they can't prove it. A jealous ex-partner, a robbery gone wrong, a predator who targeted victims of opportunity, a case of mistaken identity, something. But with the Springfield Three, nothing quite fits. Every theory has problems. Every explanation raises new questions. The lack of forced entry suggests the women knew their abductor, or that someone talked their way inside under false pretenses. Perhaps someone posing as a police officer. Perhaps someone claiming there was an emergency. Perhaps someone the women recognized and trusted enough to open the door. But who could convince three women, including a protective mother, to open the door and then comply with demands in the middle of the night? The theory that an intruder was already inside the house when Stacy and Suzie arrived seems unlikely given the lack of struggle and the evidence that the women went to bed peacefully. The beds had been slept in. The women had undressed, removed their makeup, and gone to sleep. This suggests they felt completely safe when they went to bed, which means whatever happened occurred after they had already settled in for the night, after they had let their guard down, after they had allowed themselves to feel safe. The most widely discussed theory among investigators and true crime enthusiasts is that a stranger or strangers forced entry through the unlocked door or convinced someone to open it through some ruse. Once inside, they controlled all three women through threat of violence, perhaps with a weapon. They forced them into a vehicle, and they drove away into the night, leaving behind only the purses, the car keys, nearly $900 in cash, and a terrified dog hiding in the bathroom. But even this theory has significant problems. Controlling three adult women simultaneously requires either multiple perpetrators working in coordination or an extremely efficient level of intimidation by a single person. Was a gun used? If so, how was it wielded against three people at once, especially if they were in different rooms? Did the perpetrator threaten to harm one woman unless the others complied? Was Sherrill threatened first and forced to help control her daughter and her daughter's friend? These questions may never be answered. There is one detail that has always struck investigators and observers as particularly significant and particularly disturbing. The women's shoes were left at the house. Not just the dressy shoes they would have worn to graduation parties, but their everyday walking shoes, their sneakers, their casual footwear. Three women were taken from their home barefoot. This single fact suggests several things. First, whatever happened occurred so quickly, so efficiently, that they were not given time to put on shoes. Second, they were not given the opportunity to grab jackets, cell phones. Those cell phones were not as common in 1992, or any other items they might instinctively reach for in a moment of emergency. They were taken as they were, in whatever clothing they had worn to bed, without shoes, without preparation, without the slightest opportunity to resist or escape. This speaks to a perpetrator or perpetrators who were extremely organized, extremely efficient, and extremely ruthless. This was not a crime of passion that spiraled out of control. This was not a burglary that went wrong. This was, by all appearances, an abduction carried out with planning and precision. 3 decades have now passed since that June night. If she had lived, Sherrill Levitt would be in her late 70s today, perhaps a grandmother enjoying her retirement years. Suzie Streeter and Stacy McCall would be in their early 50s, middle-aged women who might have careers, families, children of their own. Instead, they exist only in photographs, frozen forever at the ages they were when they vanished. 47, 19, 18. The families have never stopped searching for answers. They have appeared in countless news reports, documentary programs, and podcasts. They have offered rewards for information. They have begged anyone with knowledge of what happened to come forward. And occasionally, they have found themselves the targets of cruel hoaxes and false hopes. People claiming to know where the bodies are buried. People claiming to have seen the women alive in other states. People whose lies only deepen wounds that have never healed. In June 1997, on the 5th anniversary of the disappearance, a memorial bench was dedicated to the Springfield Three in Phelps Grove Park in Springfield. The dedication ceremony was attended by family members, friends, and community members who had never forgotten. The bench remains there today, a quiet place where people can sit and remember three women who deserved so much better than they got. Springfield itself has never forgotten. Images of the three women still hang in storefronts around the city. Annual remembrance events are held. The case is woven into the city's collective memory, a cautionary tale and an open wound simultaneously. Young people who were not even born in 1992 know the names of the Springfield Three. They know the story of the graduation night that ended in darkness. They know that somewhere, perhaps still in the Springfield area, perhaps scattered across the country, there are people who know what happened. People who have kept this secret for more than 30 years. The case has been featured on numerous true crime programs over the years. America's Most Wanted covered it multiple times. Dateline NBC investigated it. The show Disappeared devoted an episode to it. People Magazine Investigates examined it. Each new program brings a fresh wave of tips, a brief resurgence of hope that maybe this time, someone will come forward with the information that breaks the case wide open. But each time, the wave recedes and the silence returns. In recent years, the case has experienced something of a renaissance in the true crime community. In 2020, a book titled Gone in the Night by brothers Brian and Alan Brown provided a comprehensive examination of the case. In 2021, a podcast called The Springfield Three, a small-town disappearance by and Roderick Jones brought the case to a new generation of listeners. And in 2025, a new book by Dylan McDermott and former FBI agent Christopher Whitcomb promises to draw on more than 20,000 pages of forensic documents and investigation files. Each new examination of the case brings renewed attention, brings renewed hope, brings renewed pressure on authorities to continue investigating, to try new approaches, to never give up. Because somewhere in those 20,000 pages of documents, somewhere in those 5,000 tips, somewhere in the memories of people who were in Springfield in June 1992, there might be the answer. The piece that makes everything else make sense. Perhaps it was a single perpetrator who has since died, taking the truth to their grave. Perhaps it was a group of people, some of whom still walk free, still live normal lives, still attend church and work jobs and raise families while carrying the knowledge of an unspeakable act. Perhaps the truth is stranger and more complex than any theory that has been publicly discussed. All that is certain is that at some point between roughly 3 in the morning and 9 in the morning on June 7, 1992, three women ceased to exist in any way that the world could detect. There is one final element of this case that deserves deep consideration: the pure, terrible randomness of it. If the situation at Janelle Kirby's house had been different, if there had been room for two more girls to sleep over, Stacy and Suzie would have spent the night there instead. They would have woken up on June 7th with hangovers perhaps, tired perhaps, but alive. Whatever happened at the Delmar Street house would have happened only to Sherrill, if it happened at all. Would Sherrill have survived alone? Or was the presence of the two younger women somehow essential to the perpetrator's plan? Was this a crime of opportunity, triggered by someone seeing all three women enter that house? Or was it meticulously planned by someone who knew, or guessed, that graduation night would bring Suzie home? That circumstances might conspire to gather all three women in one place at one time? We think of our lives as the product of our choices. We choose where to go, who to see, what to do. But the Springfield Three remind us that sometimes our fates hinge on the smallest, most random factors. A house too crowded with relatives. A last-minute decision to sleep somewhere else. A change of plans made at 2 in the morning. And suddenly, the entire trajectory of multiple lives is altered forever. The answers to the questions this case raises lie somewhere in the past. Perhaps in the memory of someone who was there. Perhaps in evidence that was never recovered or properly analyzed. Perhaps in a shallow grave in the forests of rural Missouri that has yet to be discovered. Perhaps beneath a parking garage that authorities refuse to excavate. Perhaps in a location so remote, so carefully chosen, that it will never be found until development or erosion or sheer chance reveals what has been hidden. Until those answers are found, if they ever are, the Springfield Three will remain frozen in that last moment of normalcy. Three women in a house. The porch light on. A dog sleeping peacefully, unaware of what was coming. Suzie and Stacy settling into that new king-sized waterbed, excited about the future, exhausted from a night of celebration. Sherrill in her own room, a book beside her bed, drifting off to sleep knowing her daughter was home safe. And then, in the darkest hours of the night, something entered that house. Something or someone that changed everything. Something that left only questions and grief in its wake. The cases that haunt us most are not always the ones with the most graphic details or the most obviously evil villains. Sometimes they are the ones that make no sense at all. The ones where the evidence points nowhere. The ones where the victims seem to have evaporated into thin air. Because these cases remind us of something we would rather not acknowledge. That sometimes people simply disappear, and the world keeps turning, and the answers never come. And families are left with nothing but the terrible burden of uncertainty, the impossibility of closure, the endless loop of what-ifs and maybes that play in their minds year after year after year. Somewhere tonight, in Springfield, Missouri, the house at 1717 East Delmar Street still stands. It has been sold and resold over the years. Other families have lived there, made their own memories in those rooms, perhaps unaware or perhaps acutely aware of the tragedy that soaked into those walls. The porch light may or may not be on, depending on the habits of whoever lives there now. But in our collective memory, that light is always on, always glowing in the darkness, always waiting for three women who will never come home. This case was not an isolated failure of investigation or attention. It was, and remains, a mirror reflecting the limitations of justice itself. It shows us that sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite our technology, despite our determination, some secrets remain buried. Some questions remain unanswered. Some families never get the resolution they deserve. And across America, in police files and family homes, and the dark corners of human memory, other cases wait their turn. Other disappearances that were never solved. Other families that were never given peace. The Springfield Three have become a symbol for all of them. A reminder that some stories have no endings. Only silence. And an open door. And an empty house. And three women who are still waiting to be found. If you have any information about the disappearance of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall on June 7, 1992, please contact the Springfield Police Department at 417-864-1810. Even the smallest detail, something that seemed insignificant at the time, might be the piece that finally solves this puzzle. Someone knows what happened that night. Someone has carried this secret for 33 years. And perhaps, finally, it is time for the truth to come out. Because somewhere, three women are waiting. And their families are waiting. And an entire community is waiting. Waiting for the day when the silence is finally broken. Waiting for the day when the answers come. Waiting for the day when Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy can finally come home. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more content like this.